Hi, good morning once again, everybody. Welcome to Tuesday morning. We are actually beginning Unit 9, the last unit of the course. We'll be wrapping that up over the course of the next couple of days here, and we get down to review on next Monday, starting next Monday, reviewing starting from the very beginning of the course and working our way all the way through. Just a reminder, we're working on skills every single day, all skills that will be tested potentially on the AP exam, which of course there's more details coming on that as well. So thank you again for tuning in this morning. We really appreciate it. So today's topic is Reagan and the Reagan administration. And yesterday, Ms. Farr spent quite a bit of time going through the connections of period 8 and the changes of the Cold War and the civil rights movement that was happening and the change in the government's role. All those are the background for the rise of Ronald Reagan, who becomes president in 1980. So we'll spend a little time looking at that. So I'm Mr. Horton from Williamsville South High School, just outside of Buffalo, for those of you just tuning in for the first time. And welcome again to our daily show here at 11 a.m., reviewing information from the AP U.S. History course, or APUSH as we affectionately call it. So remember, you can tweet your questions to @virtualapush. That is being manned this morning by my partner in crime, Ms. Farr, and she'll be answering. She actually has a great question for you this morning. And a couple of the shout outs that we missed yesterday before we get into things: Panther Creek High School, Long Beach Polytechnical, and Southside High School in Youngsville. So a little shout out to them and to the teachers, and really all the teachers out there that are working hard to help students through this craziness that is the pandemic of COVID. So on to our practice question, the first question of the morning, which you sort of left off yesterday with. So just, I'm going to give you a minute to read through this document, which is from Ronald Reagan's speech. So just give you a minute to read through that. Think about what's Reagan's point of view in this question, or quotation rather. So Reagan's point of view: Reagan implies that the national government is too large and that taxes are too high. Both are conservative beliefs that help propel him into the presidency. So a couple days ago, when I talked about some of the transitions, we talked about Barry Goldwater, for example, who is the founding father, often considered to be the founding father of the modern conservative movement. And one of the things that Barry Goldwater advocated was less of a role of the national government in the economy, and so and in our lives, generally speaking. So this quotation really is very similar to that. So we're going to look at some of those ideas about conservatism and see how they play out in the 1980s. So just as a reminder, on the AP exam, there's three sort of levels of comparison, if you want to think of it that way. So one way is to describe the similarities or differences between one topic or another, or one time period or another. The second is to explain the relevant similarities and or differences. Can you explain why they might be similar or different? And then the third level is explaining the relative historical significance of similarities and or differences. So what that means is to think about this in terms of which is the most important versus which is the least important, the historical significance type of question here. So let's think of a simple example. I'll give you a quick example here of that. If we were comparing World War I and World War II, what would the three levels look like? We could describe the differences between World War I and World War II, for example, soldiers' lives in those two wars, the causes. Or we could move down to that higher level, which is what we're pushing students to do here, is to explain the relative historical significance. Why does it matter that World War I and World War II are similar in this way? And why does it matter that they're different in this other way? Which one's the most important similarity and or difference between those two wars? So think about that as we go through the lesson, and we'll kind of revisit this towards the end. So comparison is a lot more than just, okay, this is different than that because. It's why does it matter? Why does it matter historically speaking? And as I put at the bottom here, a sophisticated answer would point out why the similarities or differences were important in those two cases. So our lesson overview today, we're going to do focus really on topic 9.2, Reagan and Conservatism. The skill will be comparison. That's why we started out with that. The little definition of that or redefinition of that. And argument development. I want you to think about that in the background here. One of the skills on the DBQ, of course, is to develop a cogent argument, historical argument throughout the essay. So we're going to kind of work towards that. Things you should already know, the 1920s. I'm going to use the 20s as a launching point to kind of compare to the 1980s. And so that you'll see is really the focus of the lesson here. And hopefully by the end of this, you'll be able to start thinking about how would you go about comparing the 2 decades historically. We have not had a comparison DBQ question on the AP yet. So we've had CCOT, continuity and change over time questions. We've had causation questions, but we haven't had this one yet. So our guided practice really is going to be a quick review of the 1920s and then an introduction of things in the 1980s. So in the 1920s, we had a policy called trickle-down economics, and it basically includes the 4 things that you'll see here. We're actually going to watch a short clip in a second that does a good job explaining that. And in the 1980s, we're going to see how that's similar. So let's take a look at the explanation.
Supply-side economics is pretty straightforward if you follow its theoretical steps of cause and effect. The macroeconomic theory's gone by many names over the years. Trickle-down economics, Reaganomics.
I shall ask for a 10% reduction across the board in personal income tax rates for each of the next 3 years.
It's never worked out exactly as planned before, but here's the generic definition of supply-side economics from Investopedia. Greater tax cuts for investors and entrepreneurs provide incentives to save and invest and produce economic benefits that trickle down into the overall economy. We can boil all that down into 5 steps. First, Congress reduces taxes and regulations on people and businesses. Say the corporate rate going from 35% down to 20%. They'll have more money in the bank, but it won't just sit there. Step 2, that money that's been saved is then reinvested in the economy or local business. That investment leads to Step 3, more jobs. Businesses need more employees in their newly robust enterprises. People are working, earning, spending. As we know, those employees are also keeping more of their paychecks. And Step 4 is them going into the marketplace and spending that money. It might be at the mall, might be renovating a kitchen, bringing us to the final element where it all comes full circle. That money flowing into the economy hits levels so high that it more than makes up for the lost tax revenue of Step 1. Easy example here, government taxing 35% of $100 is less than 20% of $200.
Tax revenues, in spite of rate reductions, will be increasing faster than spending, which means we can look forward to further reductions in the tax rates.
Like I said, supply side's never really worked out perfectly before, but supporters insist it's never gotten a chance to fully play out.
Okay, so you'll notice even in the video, they're making that connection between trickle-down economics and supply-side economics. So supply-side economics is the name of this theory essentially in the 1980s. It's also referred to as Reaganomics. President George H.W. Bush would famously refer to it as voodoo economics a little bit later. So what I did here is you'll see there's some connections, very direct connections between these 2 economic policies from the 1920s to the 1980s. So anytime you see a blue arrow here, I'm pointing out the similarities between them. So in this case, we have all similarities between the trickle-down economics philosophy in the 1920s that were pursued by presidents like President Harding and President Coolidge, and eventually President Hoover. And in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan follows this policy as well during his presidency, cutting taxes on the wealthy. Wealthy will reinvest the money, just like what you saw in the video clip here just a second ago. So a lot of similarities here between those two decades, at least as far as government economic policy goes. Moving on to economics. In the 1920s, this is a period of economic boom for business. Some of your teachers might have referred to this as the Roaring 20s, for example, because things seem to be booming for the American economy. Consumerism is increasing, partially at least due to technology like the radio, which becomes more and more common in people's homes in the 1920s. The increased availability of credit, for example, buying stocks on margin, but farmers generally don't do very well economically here. And free trade was limited by tariffs in the 1920s. One of the aspects of the 1920s is an increase in tariff rates that occurs early in the decade and then again a little bit later on in the decade. So things go pretty well economically speaking in the 1920s. So let's do a little comparison to the 1980s. Period of economic boom, check. Yes, that's similar between the 1980s and the 1920s. Consumerism increasing, at least partially due to technology. We have, again, a blue arrow, nice similarity there. Increased availability of credit. Check on that one as well. So again, another similarity here. Farmers generally struggled economically. 1980s, that's also true. So we have lots of agreement points here on the economic angle of things, but you'll notice a difference here. And again, we have a red arrow at the bottom, which indicates the difference between the two. So the economy wasn't 100% similar in these two time periods. In the 1920s, free trade was limited by tariffs. In the 1980s, we have an era that is beginning to be defined by globalization. And Ms. Farr will be talking about that a little bit tomorrow as part of her segment on tomorrow's lesson. So, a lot of similarities here, but not all similarities, unlike the first slide that we saw. In the 1920s, influence of religious groups increases. Fundamentalists mobilized to end the teaching of evolution or Darwinism in the public schools. You might remember the very, very famous Scopes monkey trial, which was the trial of the 1920s. It is a very famous trial that takes place over whether or not science or creationism ought to be taught in public schools, and it reflects the influence of religious groups in their society. So let's see if we see anything similar in the 1920s. 1980s, excuse me. So in the 1980s, fundamentalists mobilized voters to elect more traditional leaders. You might remember, if you saw the episode a couple days ago, when we went through the DBQ on the rise of conservatism, one of the concerns of conservatives was the movement away from a more traditional culture in America. And so this is a good example of that fundamentalists mobilized. They got active and they encouraged people to go out and vote for leaders that supported anti-abortion measures, that supported prayer in schools, for just as a couple of examples here. So I think this is a similarity, I would argue, between the 1920s and the 1980s. The increased role of religious groups or influence of those religious groups. And again, our example is very similar, not really similar here. We have a cultural trial versus a president being elected. So that would be a difference. And I don't have the little red arrow there, which I should. All right, labor unions in the 1920s. Labor unions in 1919 were linked with the Red Scare. We'll go back and review that. Again, very similar to the Red Scare that Ms. Farr reviewed in the Red Scare lesson that we did a little bit last week. Labor unions struggled against companies. This is an era or a decade where for labor unions, things don't go all that well. And in fact, President Coolidge very famously broke the strike of Boston police officers before becoming president. So in that decade. So let's see how that compares to the 1980s. So in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan fired the air traffic controllers who were on strike. So kind of a backward step for labor unions. And so I would say blue arrow here, connection, a similarity between those two time periods. 1920s, labor unions struggled against companies. And I think that's a similarity here as well, that again, you'll see a little bit tomorrow that the labor union movement continues to decrease in the 1980s, less and less people joining unions in that decade. It's part of that, the overall trends that again, you'll talk about with the economy a little bit tomorrow. All right, banking in the 1920s, very little regulation on banks. Many banks crashed in 1929 as the Great Depression set in. You might remember this from your coursework, talking about the Great Depression and the run on banks that occurs because there really wasn't much regulation. The government was not ensuring bank deposits, just as an example, in that time period. So let's see, again, if we can make a connection here to the 1980s. In the 1980s, President Reagan deregulated the savings and loan industry, which led to speculation, and eventually the S&L industry collapses. So again, I would mark a similarity here. And between those two things, the less regulation led to a bank collapse in the 1920s. A reduction in regulation led to a banking crisis in the 1980s. kind of a similar connection. And of course, there are other versions of the argument here that I'm not talking about here, trying to keep this fairly simple for people. So again, I'm really positing a thesis here or an argument. So all right, scandals. In the 1920s, there is a series of scandals. This is one of the more famous of them, the Teapot Dome scandal, where members of the president's cabinet were connected into a scheme to basically steal oil from the federal government reserves by companies, which then turned around and sold it back to the American people who originally owned it in the first place. And of course, government officials being involved in this kind of thing is not what we would hope from our elected officials. So let's see if there's a connection here. And there's a scandal called the Iran-Contra affair, which included many of the president's advisors. So we'll watch a short clip that explains that story.
The Iran-Contra affair. In the early 1980s, the U.S. was still in a Cold War with Russia, and anti-communist sentiment was strong. During his presidential campaign, Reagan promised to assist anti-communist insurgencies around the world. For a brief time under Reagan, the CIA trained and assisted groups fighting communist leaders abroad. Reagan was particularly interested in a group called the Contras and their battle in Nicaragua. The Contras were a group battling the Cuban-backed Sandinistas, a communist group who had seized power in 1979. Reagan called the Contras the moral equivalent of our founding fathers. But much of the Contras funding came from the cocaine trade. Because of this, Congress passed the Bolin Amendment, specifically aimed at keeping American money from funding the group. That happened in 1982, shortly after Reagan took office. The amendment restricted the CIA and Department of Defense from using funds to provide military assistance to groups that were trying to overthrow Nicaragua's government. Groups like the Contras. This didn't stop Reagan. The president told his national security advisor, Robert McFarlane, to help the Contras anyway, regardless of the cost. McFarlane found opportunity in Iran. In 1985, an Iranian-backed terrorist group held 7 American hostages in Lebanon. Reagan insisted his advisors find a way to bring the hostages home, saying, "I want you to do whatever you have to do to help these people keep body and soul together." So with permission from Reagan, McFarlane made a deal. The U.S. would give Iran weapons, and Iran would broker the release of the hostages. This happened even though Reagan publicly insisted he would not negotiate with terrorists, and despite the fact that there was a trade embargo with Iran. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. The deal with Iran didn't just secretly secure the release of the hostages in exchange for weapons. There was money involved. While $30 million had been allocated for the weapons, the CIA funneled a portion of that money to the Contras in Nicaragua, the group Reagan supported in their guerrilla fight against the Sandinista government. In 1986, the Lebanese newspaper Al-Shura reported the arms deal, and everything began to unravel. That prompted an investigation by the U.S. Attorney General, who discovered that only $12 million of the $30 million actually went toward weapons for Iran. The rest of the money was sent to the Contras in Nicaragua. The revelations were explosive. Reagan denied the allegations that he had negotiated with terrorists, but Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North came forward and acknowledged that he diverted funds to the Contras. North also said Reagan knew about it. North's testimony would inspire the press and Congress to launch investigations against Reagan for the rest of his presidency. Texas Senator John Tower led the investigation into the scandal. The Tower Commission determined it was Reagan's lack of oversight that allowed Iran-Contra to happen, but did not implicate Reagan directly. It wasn't until another congressional investigation in 1987 that Reagan finally testified. On May 5, 1987, joint hearings were televised investigating the covert arms deal with Iran and the assistance to Nicaragua. The hearings would go on for 41 days. Reagan was never charged, but McFarlane, Oliver North, 4 CIA officers, 5 government contractors, and Reagan's national security advisor, John Poindexter, were all found guilty. Yet, speculation about Reagan's involvement lingered on. Press investigations would go on for years to follow. While Reagan's image suffered a bit, he still left office with one of the highest approval ratings of any president in U.S. history.
Okay, so kind of a complicated story there, this Iran-Contra affair. But to keep it simple here, you can see the connection between the 1920s, where there are corrupt things going on within the government's administration, especially people close to the president, and in the 1980s, where people like the National Security Advisor are implicated in this scandal. So again, another blue arrow here, another connection or similarity between those 2 decades. Immigration policy in the 1920s. The 1920s is a period of nativism, and part of this is really a response to the Red Scare or World War I. And so there are 3 laws that are passed, anti-immigration laws in the 1920s. The Emergency Immigration Act in 21, the 24 Act, which established quotas, and then 1929 Act, which restricted those quotas even more for immigrants. So, and the focus here, of course, is Southern and Eastern European immigrants, folks that are coming from places like Poland and Russia and Italy, which were, of course, the large number of immigrants coming into the country in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So we have a period of sort of anti-immigrant feeling in the time period here, and you can see this very old cartoon suggesting that we should maybe close the door on immigrants. You can see that the immigrant's head here is portrayed as a bomb with a lit fuse at the end of it here. So kind of a 1920s anti-immigrant sensation. So what's the connection here? Do we see a connection to the 1980s? In the 1980s, there is a debate over illegal immigrants. So the debate's slightly different here. But I'm going to put this as a blue arrow and say that there is still a debate over immigration. And the question in the 1980s was, should we grant amnesty to the folks that are already here? And this will be an issue that will continue on, and we'll deal with a little bit more in depth tomorrow and a little bit on Thursday as well. But the focus is different. So I'm going to go with a red arrow for that one and say that the focus in this case was illegal immigrants, mainly from Latin America in the 1980s. So we have a different group of people that's being targeted here or focused on in the two time periods. So kind of a similarity and a difference in this case, the immigration story for those 2 time periods. Reducing the federal government's role. So in the 1920s, the federal government returned to a laissez-faire approach, kind of turning 180 degrees from the progressive era, where the federal government was much more involved in the economy, regulating the economy, for example. In the 1920s, we see a return to government sort of retreating from that role. And President Coolidge, who's the guy that you see here in the image, once famously said, "The business of America is business," that we should let businesses do what they need to do and make money, and shouldn't really be government's responsibility to get too involved in that. So let's see if we can make some connections here. In the 1980s, Reagan promised to reduce the federal government role. You might remember that quote that we started off the day with, that we needed to reduce taxes and regulation. That's what he's talking about, reducing the federal government's role. And famously, Ronald Reagan said, "Government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem," which is, again, very similar to that. But in the 1980s, there were some programs that retained strong public support. It was difficult, for example, for people to get rid of the unemployment program that had been put in place. People were against changes to Social Security, as another example. So while there was an attempt to reduce the federal government's role, there were some programs that retained popularity among the population that it was difficult to get rid of. So a little bit of a difference there as well. So again, kind of a little nuance in this one. So some similarities, some differences here between those. Two more. Cultural changes. In the 1920s, we have women breaking social barriers. They, of course, get the right to vote in the 19th Amendment. So they vote for the first time in the 1920 elections. So this year in November will be the 100th anniversary of women voting in America. But then, of course, there's a debate over the proper role of women, the question of flappers, for example, in the 1920s, and women that were breaking social barriers that some people found that to be inappropriate or not okay. African Americans still face discrimination. There is what's called the Red Summer, where there's a series of lynchings and racial violence that occurs over the course of that summer. Rise of nativist groups in the United States, most notably the Klan, makes a reappearance here in the 1920s. But there also is an African American cultural renaissance that's called the Harlem Renaissance, and jazz music becomes popular, especially in Harlem and clubs like the Cotton Club, for example, in Harlem. That eventually many people in New York City would travel to Harlem to take part in music that was considered to be African American music at the time. So some connections. Definitely a connection with women. Women were breaking barriers in the 1980s. We have the first ever female Supreme Court justice nominated by President Reagan, and her name was Sandra Day O'Connor. She actually had worked as a clerk for with Barry Goldwater, and she comes from the same state, so she's acceptable to conservatives, I guess might be one way of putting that. But for the first time, we have a woman on the Supreme Court in the 1980s. We also had the first vice presidential candidate for a major party. In the 1984 election, Geraldine Ferraro runs with Walter Mondale for the Democrats against Reagan's re-election in 1984. So first time that happened. And debate over proper role of women, that debate continues. So both of those things I think are similarities here, where in the 80s, there's debate over the Roe v. Wade decision, which continues to be a controversial issue in our politics today. And whether or not women really need to be liberated is a kind of a continuation of that debate that we talked about a little bit in a couple days ago. When I talked about the rise of conservatism, you might recall that document where the woman said she doesn't need to be liberated from her family. African Americans still facing discrimination in the 1980s, race relations. Of course, the civil rights movement had made some strides forward, but there's still issues to be resolved in the 1980s, and the rise of hip hop culture for the first time in that period. So again, kind of some similarities here, both blue arrows as you see here. Last one is foreign policy. And in the 1920s, America took less of a leadership role in the world. So there's a retreat from the role that the US had played in World War I. We reject the Treaty of Versailles, for example. We don't join the League of Nations. There's a disarmament conference trying to limit the size of military arsenals in the world, especially the Navy. And the United States reduces its intervention in Latin America. So kind of retreating from taking on this leadership role. In the 1980s, I think you're going to see a lot of red arrows here on this one, because the United States, in this case, doesn't have the opportunity to do that or doesn't do that. So America was a global leader in the Cold War, where we were considered the leader of the free world. The United States is signing international treaties, like, for example, the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty between the US and the Soviet Union. SDI, which we're going to watch a quick little clip of the animation that the government put together for this. But the idea of this was to build up our military and to force the Soviets to try to keep up with the US military. So they came up with this plan that was nicknamed Star Wars. It was, the technical name for it was Strategic Defense Initiative. But there's a more aggressive standpoint against communism in the 1980s, where instead of just containing communism, the new version of anti-communist argument in the 1980s was to roll back communism, that we need to stand up and turn it backwards. That, in other words, containment was really just playing for a tie, and we needed to change that. So I'm going to say that that's a difference as well, that we're building up our military as opposed to trying to limit the size of it. Hopefully you're noticing, though, the INF Treaty is an example of disarmament. So again, if we want to be a little more nuanced here, again, I'm trying to keep this a little bit more simple. Reduced interventions in Latin America, and that is also not true in the 1980s. So we see all red arrows here. So there's a very different foreign policy between those two time periods. The US is much more involved in Latin America. You saw in the Iran-Contra scandal video, the funding of the Contras, for example, the invasion of Panama, which will happen in 1989. So again, a big difference here between the two time periods as far as those things go. So this is the government's video on that. Or maybe not. It was basically a missile defense system that was going to involve satellites floating around in space and shooting missiles out of the air. It was nicknamed Star Wars for a pretty obvious reason. It seemed like something out of a science fiction movie. So a little check for understanding here. So again, just to think about our comparison levels, describing differences, explaining the differences, why they're different, or explaining the relative historical significance of those. So again, if you get a question about relative significance on the exam, try to think about ranking the topic. What's the most important historical similarity between the 20s and the 1980s? What's the most important historical difference between the 1920s and the 1980s? So something to kind of think about there. So we're going to look at a couple different historians' answers to questions that are similar to this question of conservatism and the role of the government in the world here, kind of shifting gears just a little bit. So what is this historian's argument about the reason that Reagan won the elections of 1980 and 1984? So we'll start the timer here, give you a minute to read through, see if you can come up with an answer to that question. All right. So hopefully you had a chance to read through that and try to make some sense out of what this historian was suggesting. And so I think the key line here is this one: wisdom of low income taxes, virtue of entrepreneurs, parasitic character of government, need for military strength, depending on social health here. So he's emphasizing that these are the reasons why conservatism succeeded in the 1980s. So let's try that again with a different historian to see what his answer to the question is. So we'll get this timer started here for you. Okay, so this historian has a little bit different answer for us here. And so I would highlight this passage. It's the presence of persistent inflation, changes wrought at home by the process of globalization that exacerbated those conflicts and elected Reagan. It was the downturn in the inflation rate and an upturn in the economy that clinched his reelection. So he is, of course, emphasizing a different answer to why Reagan was successful. Between these two historians. So we're going to do a comparison here, just like what we were doing with the 1920s and the 1980s here. So these are the two arguments, just to put them on the screen here for you. Hopefully we're not blocking you off too much here, but let's think about what's the similarity between the two historians' arguments. How are they the same? So I'll give you about 40 seconds to try that out. So we could describe the differences between the two of them, but that's not as much fun as it is to analyze the differences, right? So what's the similarity between the two of them? The conservative movement grew during the 1980s. Reagan was elected because the movement of the nation in a more conservative or rightward direction is a similarity. Politics were redefined during the 1980s because of social and economic forces. So they both are basically arguing these basic truths between the two historians here. But let's try the other side of the coin here. What is the difference between these two historians' arguments? So we'll get the timer going here again for you. Okay, so the difference between those two. Rossinow emphasizes politically, conservatives redefined the era, made conservative ideas seem like common sense, so he emphasizes ideas in politics, where Berman emphasizes the economic changes being the most important thing. So if we think about a question that asked us potentially, what's the relative significance of the causes of the rise of conservatism in the 1980s? These two historians give us a different answer to that question. So just to go back here, Rossinow is not emphasizing economic changes while Berman is emphasizing those. So these two would have two very different approaches to that question, but both are historically defensible, and both could write a good essay for our exam if they needed to do that. So again, thinking about that relative significance between the two things here, kind of tying back to what we started the day with a little bit with those. So debrief. Analyze the extent to which the decades of the 20s and the 80s were similar. Just a reminder, we talked about a lot of similarities. So if this was our question, a potential thesis might be there were similarities in economic policy and the cultural conflicts seen in both periods, but a large difference in the foreign policies of those two decades. And I'm not going to rehash all the things that we talked about, but my argument would be obviously that there were way more similarities and these were more important than the differences, if this was actually an essay question on the exam. So let's try a couple exam practice questions, and we're going to use those same two passages that we just looked at, Rossinow and Berman passages. So see if you can come up with an answer for this multiple choice question based on those two excerpts. Okay, so hopefully you had a chance to read through those choices. Really what they're asking here is, what's the similarity between the two of those passages in one sense? And the best answer here is A, conservatives are willing to increase government spending. And that's the best answer out of these here. If we work from the bottom up, U.S. public widely supported sending forces. That's not true in the post-Vietnam era. Hence the secret funding and aid to the Contras. Military national security policies changed to reflect the aim to combat terrorism. That, of course, won't happen until after September 11th of 2001. More on that on Thursday. And political leaders shifted focus to provide aid in humanitarian crises rather than to directly engage in conflicts. And that's something that will happen in the 1990s, not in this time period. So here's another question for you, another multiple choice based on those two passages. We'll get the timer started for you. Okay, so this one directly asks, what's the similarity between the arguments in the two passages that we saw here? And of course, the best answer is C, conservatism had a widespread impact beyond just the election of Reagan. It's not just Reagan is kind of what they're saying. And last question on those two passages. And here it is. What's the difference between the arguments made by those two? So we'll let the timer roll here. Okay, did you get it? I bet you that you did. The best answer is B, exactly what we pointed out when we went through looking at some of those examples. One more question on those two passages. Okay, so I forgot to start the timer there. Sorry for that. So let's work our way through this. So evangelical support for liberal social policies. Hopefully you identify that evangelicals typically did not support liberal social policies. Supporters of the Democratic Party pushed initiatives to increase taxes, and that's really not the best answer here. The best answer, of course, is D. And the reason it's not C is hopefully you identified that that also is not true. Conservatives did not want Reagan expanding the power of the federal government, going all the way back to Barry Goldwater, where we sort of started the day today. So let's try this one. This is a different historian passage. All right, so if you think about the last couple of days worth of our online lessons here, hopefully you crossed out letter C and letter D right away, because liberals, of course, were not ignoring racial discrimination and poverty with things like the Great Society programs and the Civil Rights Movement. But the answer here is A, that liberals were criticized for not being closely aligned with the traditional society in America is basically what that's suggesting. Let's try this one. Here they're asking you to connect evidence to that passage. Okay. And of course, the election of Reagan is the best answer here. Of course, we're not talking about the end of the Cold War. We'll get to that tomorrow in tomorrow's lesson. C isn't a good answer because that's not, of course, what Republicans were supportive of. And D is not something that certainly would have led to the rise of support for the Republican Party. So we're going to move right to the end here because we're running out of time. Thank you again for watching today. We hope that you'll join us again tomorrow when we pick up the story where I've sort of left it off here and talk about the next little piece of period 9, which we definitely will be done with by the end of the week here. Don't forget to tweet your questions to virtual APush. We have a Twitter question going on today, the guesses on the DBQ for this year. Liliana, thinks that it's going to be rights of women or African Americans over time. And Alan thinks that it's going to be conservatism of the American Revolution. That's an interesting question. If we get to that, we'll be reviewing that stuff starting next week. So hopefully you'll be able to tune in for that. So your question for tomorrow that Ms. Farr will start off with for you: what event is being depicted in this political cartoon? What is the artist's point of view about that question? So something for you to think about here as we kind of wind things down. So remember, if you know of anybody that's struggling with technology, cb.org/tech, TECH, and those folks can get some help as far as that goes. And so we're going to count down today. Thank you very much again for tuning in. Hopefully we'll see you again real soon. Thanks for watching Virtual APUSH. Have a good day.